Wow, that was the first time I've seen that. That's a pretty good animation.
That was not bad. Yeah,
I like that, Rye. Yeah, I'm not gonna dwell on it. It did have shades of 70s adult content for the audio. Welcome to
wait a minute. Wait a minute. How would you know this?
Rigorous study. The show is Unbuffered. I'm Chris Mitchell, and I'm still getting used to my dumb face. I spent the last several months growing out a beard trying to rival Doug. I ended up traveling to Alaska, and I was like, I can't cut my beard before I go to Alaska. And I came home, and my wife said, now is the time. So I've used my dumb face again. I liked hiding it behind more hair. I'm Chris Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. This is our first live show of Unbuffered. We're excited to be back and having this format again. We're going to be playing with some new ideas as we try this out. But today we've got a great panel to discuss the news of the day, the week, or the past 4 months, depending on how you want to look at it. We've got Heather Mills, who is a principal consultant with ITG Communications. Welcome back, Heather.
Thank you.
And we've got Doug Dawson, who's still at CCG. He hasn't kicked himself out, so we'll probably retire there at some point. Welcome back, Doug.
My wife keeps threatening to fire me, but yes, it hasn't happened yet. So.
At least she doesn't make you trim your beard.
She does not. She actually hates when I trim my beard. I like that. So yeah.
All right, and then I think making your unbuffered debut, but also having not been on Connect This, we've got Drew Garner, who is the Director of Policy Engagement at the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. I was a longtime listener to Connect This, so it's a pleasure to actually be on the show.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's great to have you here. We had what we thought were the records of how many people watched the show, and I feel like I've met them all individually. We loved all the people that tuned in. Trying to figure out if we can do some work to get that audience up a bit as we play around with Unbuffered. Today, we're going to be talking about sci-fi, just briefly. There's a couple of topics we're going to handle briefly and try not to get lost in so that we can get lost in BEAD later on in the show. The show is going to be about 60 minutes. We're going to try and keep them tight. That's one of the new things we're trying. We're going to talk about Amazon Leo just a little bit, which is Amazon's name for its Leo service. And we're going to talk about efforts to preempt local government to encourage more investments in internet access. Never tried that before. We'll see how it goes. Talk a little bit about mobile wireless because I've driven around the country a whole lot just recently and I have opinions. But we're going to talk about permitting a little bit more in depth. There's a lot that's been going on with that. And that'll lead us into BEAD because one of the issues with BEAD will be permitting. So if there's time, which I hope there will be, we will also be touching on affordability programs, something that Drew's been focused on and folks on my team have been doing as well. So jump into the chat and feel free to throw us a curveball, say hi. It'd be wonderful. But let's start with sci-fi being sold. And I don't know. Let me just come out of the gate with a baseball bat and say, I think a lot of us were kind of expecting this. And I was interested to see that it was sold to the people that lent it money, which to me sounds a lot like bankruptcy. So I don't know. Doug, I want to go to you first on this. What happened with sci-fi?
That's my guess because they're a company who builds open access networks. It's not nearly as profitable as retail ISPs. And they already had backed out of 4 or 5 markets. There was one that they were supposed to start constructing like a month later, and then they just didn't show up. And that city's one of my clients, and they're still incredibly upset. They did build some markets though. They just finished. Right. They just completed Farmington and Farmington Hills, Michigan. So, but they probably backed out of what do you think? They're half or 2/3 of their commitments. So they needed money. They just didn't have enough cash. So I think that this brings the cash infusion in. I'm going to guess that they still own a minority share. I mean, they might have sold it outright. Who knows? But that company didn't have enough money to do what they wanted. And so now they probably will go into a lot of markets. And And we all love open access. I mean, it's a really good thing to bring to a city. So it's really interesting to see if they do better. So yeah.
Heather, are they going to snap their fingers and magically figure out how to operationalize this audacious goal that they have? I mean, I love the goal, they just weren't able to get it done.
Yeah, if anything, this it's like a signal, like the long-term infrastructure investors actually do care about open access in some way, or they believe in it in some way. So I think that's a good thing. Um, it's always harder to do it than to think it. That's the problem. And so, but and there's a number of different, I'm going to call them challenges that get them there. But I'm buoyed by the fact that there are investors out there that are interested in an open access plan like that. So.
Drew, do you have any reaction to having watched sci-fi over all these years?
Ju Not too much. I would agree with Heather's comments on it's encouraging to see support for open access. Um, but beyond that, this isn't one of those issues I've been super deep on. So I'll leave it to Doug and Heather on this.
So one of the things that I saw that I'll say is that there are companies we talk about, usually without mentioning their names. And often I don't even know their names, but there are companies that are out there that are just engaged in fraudulent activities to raise money, to pad themselves ridiculous salaries, and then to not deliver or to sell it to a chump. That is not sci-fi, in my impression. They really wanted to see this happening, but from the beginning, they had lawsuits with subcontractors, lawsuits with cities. It seemed like they couldn't get out of their own way. And I don't know enough about all of this stuff, but to comment on what exactly happened, but it just seemed like there was always something that was slowing them down, Doug. But they made announcement
Yeah.
after announcement that drove me nuts while they weren't actually breaking ground in as many. And at one point, I just gave up on trying to figure out what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, they were really gonna go gangbusters and they just failed. So, we'll see. Now operationally, that's a whole other question. It's we'll see how good they are at operating an open access network. It's not as easy as it sounds. So,
And then the last thing is I've talked about this before, and I feel like people don't appreciate it, but I've always thought when you see a company building infrastructure in America with European money, there's a long record of that not turning out super well if you are into the railroading history of the United States of America or other big infrastructure challenges. So this wasn't the biggest surprise to me that it ended here, I guess.
we also have a big cable company. Altice has not been a very sterling success here either with European money. Yeah, so I agree with that. What's interesting is their biggest backer is Germany. Germany doesn't do open access or equal open access.
I thought it was Denmark
It's it it
pension
was
fund.
Denmark.
well, it was all Denmark? Well, that's good to know
It was
'cause
I think it
they
was a mix, but it was a lot of Denmark, I
oh,
think.
okay,
It was a mix.
okay.
You're right, it was a
That's
mix.
next. Okay, good. That's good.
That reminds me also. Okay, so we're moving into the next topic. This is a good point to note. On our last show, which was not live, but we had a little panel show with Jade Pyros and Sean. We talked about Switzerland, and I'm always nervous talking about Europe for the same sort of reason that I just said. They don't always understand how investments are going to play out here. I don't always understand what's happening over there. I would say that if you listen to that show, I was suspicious that Switzerland wasn't as good as that article claimed, and I had multiple people reach out to me who know a lot more about this than I do, and they were like, "Yeah, that wasn't it's not like totally bogus, but it wasn't a good picture of all of Switzerland or even how they got there." So, for people that want to dig in, there are resources you can find, I'm sure, if you really want to know how Switzerland's going. And when you read something that says this country got it totally right, odds are they're just ignoring the contrary evidence, in my experience. Countries are mixed bags.
They are. I mean, Switzerland has some pockets of 25 gig home broadband, but they also have lots of places that don't have that. So, yeah, it's
Yes.
not it's not as good as they make it sound. But the fact that they have any is kind of awesome. So, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the point that I feel like I can make is, we have great connectivity in some places here in the United States, and other places not so great, and that's true in many places in Europe. But when I talk to people that travel throughout France, for instance, rural France, if you're more likely to end up with a pretty great connection. I don't know that I would trade a random rural France connection for a great municipal or cooperative connection in the United States. But they're doing pretty well, and they have a pretty big focus on that. Other countries like Belgium, not so great. So there's a mix. We've talked about this in the past. We're going to move on to something. I'll come to you first, Drew, because I feel like Benton really tracks this sort of thing pretty closely. That is this totally new, never been tried before idea of why don't we just severely restrict local government authority, and then magically the private sector will want to invest tons more money into competitive networks and speedier networks, and all of our problems will be solved. This is a bill that's advancing. It had been advancing, seems to have stalled in DC in the House. So what's happening there with the American Broadband Deployment Act?
Yeah, so that's correct. This would have been speaking of whether Europe understands how to deploy in the States, like it's unclear if DC sometimes understand how to deploy in the States, as evidenced by this bill that would have, I think, had a lot of issues would have preempted a lot of local government authority over broadband permitting across the board. Doug has written well about this, I think, where some of these issues make a lot of sense in rural areas, but this would have been rural, suburban, and urban preemption. It would have put a shot clock on local government's ability to approve or deny broadband permit applications, and then if the local government did not respond within time, it would have been deemed approved. So this is sort of, if you don't act, then the ISP can move forward, whatever your decision, if you miss the deadline. So this, as you said, Chris, was delayed. It was on its way to the House Rules Committee, which is a step before it goes to the floor for a full vote. So it looked like congressional leadership thought that this might be able to get enough support that they were willing to arrange some time for it. But then before its actual hearing, it was pulled back. So my suspicion is that they're not able to get full Republican support for this bill. It doesn't mean just that it's out of the woods yet. It very well could and probably will, is still being worked on and may come back. But it's still hanging out there. And I'm sure will come as no surprise to people listening to this call, a lot of the local government associations, NACO, National League of Cities, some of these associations have come out very strongly against this bill.
Yeah, NATOA has always been very active on this sort of thing as well. The National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. Almost ran out of time in the show to finish that off. Doug, you've written about this?
Yeah, this started out as the concept behind this was let's make it easier to build BEAD and other federal grants. So this was a rural idea. And the funny thing is, and I see if Heather backs me up on this, most of my clients building in rural areas don't have a problem getting permits from counties. The counties are going like, you want to build fiber here? Well, how can we help you? And so this is, and what it doesn't fix is the one problem we do have in rural areas, which is bridges, bridges and railroads. It doesn't help those at all. That's where all the problem is. And so, and then there's a whole nother set of laws that Drew could talk about. I don't think we're going to get there today to talk about the federal lands. That's a whole nother nightmare. But so all of a sudden, this thing morphed into everywhere in the whole country. So this basically goes to the big companies: build anywhere you want, anytime you want. This would allow them to go and dead center of Manhattan on a corner put a cell tower if they wanted to. It's really unbelievable. It's the wish list of what they've always wanted. This is a big company bill now, so it's absolutely crazy. And if I've worked with people trying to get permits in downtowns of some of the major cities. They need to take a long time. It's a massively complicated underground system there, and usually they don't have good records, and they have to actually do a study just to find out if there's a place to put the new guy. It's crazy to give them right of ways. It's just insane. So,
Heather, I have a follow up for you after you launch your initial salvo.
No, I think Doug and I are pretty well aligned here. I think the all bets are off when it comes to permitting at the local level. They're going to do it in the time that they have available to do it with the staff that they have. And there's all sorts of initiatives happening in the BEAD program in the background. People are talking about, well, how can we help those local permitting agencies? Is it through potentially use of non-deployment funds over here to help them staff up, or some other mechanism? I'm worried about volume. That's what I'm worried about. I'm not worried about the process itself. I think that all politics is local. And the reason that those localities have the rules they have in place is because that's what they want in place in order to do their job well, in order to manage their community. But I get the frustrations and the timing and everything that comes along with that in a number of places, especially when you're going from if you're starting in a more metropolitan dense area and moving to a more rural area, the people change, meaning why they're where they are is different than there. So, what's your follow up question?
Do you remember how, if we gave the wireless folks broad preemption and really restricted the ability of local governments to stop their siting, that we would have full blown wireless competition? I mean, Verizon was going to build out all of Sacramento in 2018, I want to say, and have gigabit wireless to the home that was going to be very competitive with Comcast. I don't remember what happened, but the world looks a lot similar to the way it did before we gave massive deregulation of local oversight for the wireless industry. Is that, I don't know how you recall it.
I don't recall it necessarily that way. I know that in the before times, as I like to recall anything before 2020, it was a very different outlook on priorities and why we were doing the things that we were doing. And depending on the locality, how they were doing it, more dense areas like that, they were trying to do a wireless play because it makes sense in a number of ways to try to do that. But all politics is local, so just different. Did I answer your question? I tend to get a little lost sometimes.
Yeah, no, I do that to people. I feel like the history of this preemption is that it ends up just losing public dollars, in that the private sector invests perhaps 10% more than they would have otherwise, and the federal and the local folks lose a bunch of the fees, and we start having towers that are 50 feet tall in the middle of residential areas, and people get really frustrated that they're there and out of character for the neighborhood.
I mean, there's a lot of throughout every jurisdiction that I've worked in there's a lot of like aesthetics rules that have to go into play as well. Some jurisdictions are more advanced than others in doing that. Some haven't had to deal with that before. And now they have the opportunity to expand access, and they've got a 50-foot tower and they're like, ick. But if they want the access, they're going to have to figure that out and talk to themselves. It's about the community figuring out how they do it. And every community is going to do it differently. But it's important that they have an ear and an eye for understanding not only the public interest, but the business interest as well, because that drives the economy.
Yeah. So
No,
here's
I
the
no,
flip.
I
Go ahead,
can
Doug.
address the Verizon question. They abandoned that business plan in Sacramento and other cities for 2 reasons. One is they were gonna put a little mini cell tower site on every single block, so that everyone was gonna be within reach of it. It turned out that was incredibly expensive. On top of that, right about that same time, they decided that they didn't wanna build the fiber and own the backhaul, they wanted to lease it. And the people who were gonna lease it to them, like American Tower, they're like, "I can't afford to pay that much of a lease." So, it became economically unfeasible. They tried it in a piece of Sacramento, Detroit, and one other city, and it was a financial disaster, and they quickly abandoned it. It was never gonna work. It wouldn't work today either. You can't put a small cell site's still like $40,000. You can't put one of them every block. That's incredibly stupid electronics, so, yeah.
So, Drew,
Even if
any
they
other
were
thoughts
able
on this?
to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris. Even if they were able to make that like a wireless site, not a cell site, it would have been just as expensive, right?
If they would have truly made it wireless drops, it would have still been close to that as expensive, but they ended up with all sorts of radio interference problems
Ah,
and there was, there's just all sorts of problems out of this. Like, "Oh, it doesn't really work."
I seem to remember the folks at Vantage Point doing a study and finding that if you replace fiber to the home with that kind of going up to that close to the house, you get 80% of the cost and 20% of the benefits. And it turns out that's not a really great business proposition.
Right.
So one last piece, and I don't know, Drew, I would welcome you to shoot me down. Let me the opposite. I'm broadly sympathetic with ISPs, especially local ISPs, dealing with stupid local rules. In St. Paul, I believe I was told, I haven't verified it, but that if you want to work in the right of way close to the trees, you have to work around you have to have a GIS layer of all of the trees' root balls in order to protect the trees. And the city doesn't give that to you. You got to make it yourself. So you got to pay for it, which is ridiculous. I think the city should be like, yeah, protect our trees, but also here's the layer. But they don't do that apparently. And the city had a max permit length of like 2,000 feet or 1,000 feet or something like that, which was unlike comparable cities nearby. And I had worked with a certain someone that I knew well who builds networks in this general region. And I was like, look, I think I could put pressure on the city to modernize these rules and improve them. And I was told, yeah, but like we kind of like the rules because we figured out how to navigate them and it'll keep someone else from coming in after us. And so I don't think the industry broadly actually wants to make it super easy for everyone to build because if cities are required to have robust connections, we actually kind of end up with the reality that we cannot support massive facilities based competition. It doesn't work.
And this raises a sci-fi story. And I think it was Binghamton, but one of the New York cities, they built a network and they just plowed straight through all the root balls and they killed a bunch of trees.
Oh, it's awful. Drew, you were
And
going to say
so and they quickly changed the rules and they had to do it a different way, but they just went straight down the right of way. It's like, "No, you really shouldn't do that." So, that was one of their early builds. Yes.
Well, Chris, I think you make a good point that like reducing some of these permitting barriers can be open the door to competition. ISPs know that, cities know that. In a report I've worked on, Mesa, Arizona sort of sets a pretty good model of how they have attracted competition, where they, in their permitting process, a lot of the times it's like the uncertainty about how long is this permitting going to take, just the lack of transparency into the permitting process and the lack of capacity at the city level to process all the permits needed to really have robust competition. What Mesa did, they have a consultant reimbursement agreement model where the ISP applicant can pay an additional amount so that the city itself can hire a consultant to improve and expedite the permitting process timeline, giving some consistency to the deployment, which then allows the ISP to plan everything else around these permits. That's worked really well for Mesa, but it's because Mesa found a way to address their capacity at the city level. Um, I think one of the weaknesses with this federal permitting bill is that it doesn't acknowledge that capacity limitation in some of these cities and especially some of these rural areas where you might have a part-time staff who is partially responsible for this, being in charge of what's going to be this wave of BEAD permitting applications. So that's, I think, one of the weaknesses with the bill we were just talking about earlier. And unfortunately, this gets to the non-deployment conversation Heather mentioned. Like that is a potential use. Permitting capacity expansion is a potential use for BEAD non-deployment money. They've alluded to it many times before. Almost every time they've talked about non-deployment, they mention permitting. But at this point, we're going to be a year late when this money rolls out.
Mhm.
So I don't want to preempt the future conversation, Chris, but I think NTIA has the right idea with some of this using non-deployment to improve permitting capacity, but they need to get started 2 years ago.
yeah,
So
or be very competent, and I'm not sure that there's a record of that in the past year. So I do want to move on to Amazon Leo, which is a Leo service. And I'm not going to stop talking about how absurd it is that they freaking named it Leo for their service. They're Blue Origin, right? I'm suddenly had this big
Yes.
doubt, and
Well, actually, most of their launches are on other companies. They've leased capacity. They've only done like 2 Blue Origin launches.
right. So they're working on building a competitor to
Right.
SpaceX, and depending on who I read, it seems like they're doing pretty well. I mean, they accidentally launched someone into the wrong orbit, and they've had some challenges. But actually, on the whole, experts seem to feel like the Blue Origin whole thing is going pretty well. By the way, I'm looking forward to talking about Starship when that launches sometime before our next live show, probably, seeing what happens there. But they need an extension. And this is what kills me is the idea of this service is it's supposed to be fast. It's supposed to be like available now. And we're doing it so we don't have to spend time building infrastructure and giving people jobs in rural areas. And here they are saying they need an extra 2 years to build out.
they're the second largest BEAD winner too. 400,000 locations. Now what, a
Yeah,
2-year delay?
right.
That's this like Starlink's currently available right there. I feel for the locations that were one promised fiber and BEAD, two had it then swapped out for Leo, and now their Leo's not even going to be there.
Yes.
In addition to all the other, like when it does arrive, it'll probably have a lot of similar issues to the Leo we know today. Where it may not even work. Are you going to have to build a 40-foot pole to get reception? So yeah,
Yeah, it's really frustrating. I mean, all my frustration with Starlink is tripled for Leo, which is an unproven service. Doug, we talked about this before. We don't have to rehash
Yeah.
a lot of it, but I mean, any initial thoughts? I mean, they
Well,
bought Globalstar, so
they have
that's a
3
good sign.
yeah, they're up to 300 satellites, and if we follow what happened to Starlink, they launched their beta test with 600 satellites, and beta test meaning you would get it for 5 minutes and then it would go off for 5 minutes because there was not enough satellites to fill the sky. And Starlink finally got what we call 90 or 95% coverage when they got to about 1,600 satellites. And then, of course, as they've done more and more satellites, now most people have 2 or 3 Starlinks in the sky at the same time above them. But you go but Amazon's only launching 3,200 is their whole launch, so, they're not even gonna get to where Starlink went to commercial service till they get halfway through their constellation, which is 1,600, and that's just physics. You just have to always have one above you, right?
Well, they have right, but they have
Yes.
bigger devices and higher
Yeah, but
orbits, I think, right?
just a barely higher orbit. It's not gonna make that kind of difference. So, I mean, we're talking, 30 miles apart. It's not a big difference. So
Well, it's more
so they
kilometers, though.
they're gonna have to get halfway through before they can have an actual commercial service. And so that's not gonna happen for the rate they've been going. So, they got their work cut out for them. So and then they're supposed to be, Starlink's new satellites are very fast. They're gigabit capable. The Leo is supposed to launch with similar capacity, so they might be fairly fast. Well, take us 2 years to find out, I think.
Yeah, I'll just note I just had a chance to do a lot of Starlink in Alaska. I was up in Bristol Bay working with some of the Alaska Native villages, and it was very interesting. And I think there's a love-hate relationship with Starlink. They're thrilled to have it. There was also people building fiber to many of these villages, so that's very fortunate because when I tried to handle some of my sports photography business on Starlink, it didn't go so well. Trying to get tens of gigs of photos out to clients. Starlink was kind of like, no.
Well, they're not trying to cover the poles. I mean, they're covering the temperate areas, so
Mhm.
they're not covering
It was
the
just as
equator
tempered as
very good
Minnesota,
either.
I'll have you know, but I want to give Heather a chance to speak up
Yes.
about Leo.
Um, so I just moved in the last 24 hours, and I have a satellite thing from because I live in rural Washington State. Um, and resetting up that this morning took me an hour longer than it should have because I had to walk around my yard with my phone in my hand, trying to make things work. But I got it to work. It's clearly working. Other than that frustration, I would agree with you, Chris. I have a love hate relationship with it. The only reason I'm using it right now is because the provider that I signed up for terrestrial based fiber hadn't delivered my equipment yet. So um, I think we are going to see a real um, interesting next 5 to 10 years because right now, a lot of people see Leo as a patch, if you will, to get service that's needed to places that are too costly, if you will, based on many people's opinions, to get fiber out there. In my opinion, that doesn't mean that we stop the work. There's still work to be done. If the economy is going to grow and those places are eventually going to become less rural, then they're going to need fiber infrastructure in order to do well. Period. But I think it's an amazing tool, especially for someone like me who likes to get in my Ford F-150 and go out into a remote field and have my lunch and do some work. So I'm able to do that, and I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to argue against that.
Mm.
In the interest of time, we're going to skip ahead to mobile wireless. So I will note that This has been a big month for me. We went on spring break and drove down from Minnesota down to Oklahoma City, where we got to have, it was my first time in Oklahoma, got to have the quintessential Oklahoma experience of tornadoes and meeting other people in the hotel in the safe room in the hotel. And then headed out west to the Guadalupe Mountains. We climbed to the highest point in Texas. It was brilliant. Beautiful, beautiful area. Saw Carlsbad Caverns. Drove back up north through Colorado to Great Sand Dunes, quite possibly the best of the national parks. It's amazing. And then back home through Kansas and Nebraska, off the beaten trail. And wireless sucked. I have now T-Mobile and Verizon of the postpaid of the, I have, I threw a double eSIM on, and then I had GCI while I was up in Alaska as well. So I had triple eSIMs rocking, and the connection, I could never find a good connection from Verizon and T-Mobile, it felt like. And that's true in Oklahoma City. It was true in Amarillo. It was true in any one of these places we went. When I was a rural area, usually I could get coverage from one of them, okay, but it wasn't the same one. And it surprised me at times. And I feel like mobile wireless is just getting worse and worse, Doug. And you keep talking about how we're not going to be spending that $10 billion for the mobile wireless build out.
Right.
But is it getting worse?
It is getting worse. Let me show you a map first. I actually, since
Mhm.
you said you're going to talk about this, how the heck do I share my screen on this platform?
There's a
Present.
plus at the bottom center of
The
your
bottom.
toolbar.
Share screen. All right.
And the way you do it actually is you send it to Rye ahead of time, and he does all the work.
Uh, I think I'm good.
All right.
How come it's not sharing? Share. There we go. All right. Can you see it?
Yes.
And
Well, something like that.
So,
Yeah. There you go.
yeah, I have to minimize this. So here are two maps. This happens to be someone I'm working for right now. This is Logan County, Illinois. And their first question is 4G the same as 5G? No.
Oh,
There's
that
the
was a question I
4G
was going to come
coverage.
to. Yeah. I was
There's
going
the
to.
4G
Yeah. Go ahead.
coverage on the left. There's the 5G coverage. These are the same towers, but 5G doesn't go as far because it's using higher frequencies and they just don't go as far. Now on these maps, what you see is the dark colors are where the coverage is best and the light covers is where it's even worse. So not only does 5G not go as far, look how small the good coverage areas are. They're really tiny. And so by the time you even get to the fringe of these pink areas, it's getting very sketchy even for making a voice call. So doesn't mean all this works for voice, but this is way better. So
Doug, is it a
yeah.
conspiracy theory to think, though, that I might be on that 4G coverage and they might have the 5G lit up on my phone?
Nah, whichever your phone says is usually right, but
Okay.
you can't. But it's no guarantee. I mean, carriers are carriers, and we don't trust or
Are,
like any of them.
are you counting back to when AT&T did that when they originally were
Yeah,
trying to sell the 5G stuff? Like that was
right,
2016, wasn't it?
Well, but
right.
also I feel like there are claims I thought there were claims that one could get 5G from T-Mobile in many more areas, and they're talking about it being like 2 megabits a second. When they started doing some of that, to me, that seems like they are claiming 5G. So, like, yes, if you're using the millimeter waves on 5G, but can't you use 5G with the other spectrum that has better propagation over greater distances as well?
Millimeter wave only covers like 1% of the whole US market. That's not real stuff. It's only in downtowns. So, yeah, you're not getting that anywhere else. So, um, that's the stuff that they did back in the old days when they had, remember the commercials where they said, "Look at my gigabit cell phone."
Mhm.
They put that up and they've never taken it down, but
Yeah.
that's very
All
minor.
right. Well, I'm
Yeah,
gonna save this for a future show because I want to have Mike Dano back on,
yeah,
who's now at Ookla. We had him on before, and
yeah.
real mobile wireless expert about some of this.
But
Um,
bottom line is it's getting worse. Coverage, speeds are getting better, coverage is getting worse.
all right. Any
Yeah.
comments on that, Drew or Heather?
Uh, for not wireless, but or not mobile, but for my fixed wireless service at my house, I noticed just recently when spring started that service got much worse.
Yes,
Um,
trees.
yeah, because of
Trees.
the trees. As the foliage
Yep.
comes out every summer, I noticed this. And then to your point about the mobile wireless, I took a train recently from Chicago to LA, Southwest Chief. PSA, they don't offer internet service on those trains. So I didn't even think to check, but I learned that the hard way. So I used my phone as a hotspot to work the whole trip. And coverage is also spotty on that route. So that was a very that was a tricky experience.
You got to be careful because some of the operating systems detect if they're on a hotspot, and then they try to download 10 gigabyte patches to really hurt your bill. That's another conspiracy theory. I guess I'm just going to launch into those today.
It doesn't seem right. Yeah.
That doesn't
No,
seem right.
that's
No.
just classic bad luck. So permitting, we talked briefly about this, but there's been some proposals that seem not unreasonable to me to scale back some of the larger scale permitting. Doug, you mentioned earlier in rural areas, the counties, they're totally willing to work with you to figure out how to make it work in most cases. That's been my experience as well. The challenge people get hung up on is federal agencies. And I'll just note that like the senators in DC, particularly Western senators who are Republican, in my experience, love to talk about how the federal government sucks at this. And then those departments say, well, you know what we need is we need people, and here's a budget where we can hire people to turn the permits around faster. And the Republican senators are like, that's funny. There's no way you're getting more money.
Right.
So we're in this standoff. But there's now suggestions both nationally and in California that, hey, if you're deploying a wire alongside a road that's already been disturbed, maybe we need something called a categorical exemption. And to me, it seems great. And so, Heather, let me go to you first and ask you, because you work both sides of this, depending on which hat you're wearing. Are these things, are these no brainers? Are these things that should be moving forward, or should I be concerned that we're about to pave over the redwoods or something?
Um, so what I find interesting, so I think CEQ issued something earlier in April, right? NTIA for BEAD purposes is already doing most of that. And I'm excited to see, I think it's going to be a great test case, if you will, to see how they call categorical exclusions or CXs, are able to get through that system. And in the small test cases that we've seen so far, it's categorical exclusions are being approved within a few weeks. And so the BEAD program is really going to test out, it's called the ESAPT system, ESAPTT. It starts with an environmental and ends with tool, and then there's other words in there. DC really likes their acronyms. It's going to be interesting to see how this comes together. I'm very excited about it. It's also going to allow the way the ESAP systems work is in order to process things the way that you have to in order to get them in there. You're going to know going into it as a BEAD participant what areas are going to be pretty well categorically excluded. You'll have a really good sense of that, and you'll know what areas won't be because you're doing that work, beforehand, and you'll understand what path you're going on. What I like about the way that it's been set up for BEAD is that depending on the state that you're in and how they're processing it, you can set up NEPA sub-project areas to help find efficiencies going through. Now, there's rules around how you do it in certain ways, but it's going to help get, I'm going to say, shovels in the ground a lot faster than what we're used to in the past. So,
Drew, do you react with a foreboding whenever you hear any sort of streamlining out of the people who are currently in power?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but what Heather says, I think makes a lot of sense for these areas. So, like, actually, no, I think permitting across the country is you really have to look at the location to figure out, like, is it actually a permitting issue or is it an issue with something else? So whenever I hear from the federal government talking about streamlining local permitting, I get a little bit queasy just because, like, we kind of know what it means as we talked about there at the top of the call. But this particular issue, less so. I think that it can make sense in some areas, and I don't like as long as we're not running down the redwoods. Like, I think that's not what this will do. It will protect some of those areas while still allowing it in areas where we've already done the analysis.
I think
I'm still stuck with the picture of paving over the redwoods. I try to picture that. That's a lot of paving.
It's a lumpy road. I admit it. Yeah.
But I mean, I have two comments on this. One is this is the common sense we've always wanted, because it's like, hey, I'm burying fiber along the side of a road that's been dug up 6 times, there's other utilities in there. I'm not going into the woods, marshes, and so there's 3 category exceptions. One of them would allow an agents to do that. But the other issue where I get a little queasy is every agency is going to interpret it. We may get 3 different interpretations from the FCC, NTIA, and USDA. It's not going to. They each have to make up their own mind of how to apply it because the first rule says if there's ever been an exception in the past, you can follow it. But most of them are just going to be rule 2 and 3, which says use your common sense, and they may not apply common sense the same way. But it's still a big improvement because there used to be no exceptions for common sense. So that's we like this. Now, if you have a project that goes through marshland or Indian burial grounds, it's still going to be 2 years. This
Yes.
does not get you out of those. So if you have your BEAD project through those kind of places, you still got a big problem. But that's always been there. You should have known that before you applied for it, to be honest. So
Heather?
Yeah, it's important that people do their homework too.
yeah.
We spent the last 20, 30 years recognizing that installing something in a previously disturbed right of way is really not going to have a lot of impact. But depending on whose land you're on and what they value as important or not important, that also adds to the level of complications there. I've been working on some complex federal level permitting that involves BLM, BIA, Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and NTIA in one sitting. That's going to take a good effort to get through. It has taken a good effort to get through. And it's hurting cats on a new level. It's hurting cats on a federal level, along with locals as well. And so, believe it or not, the local permitting, once they get the sign off from the federal agencies, they can get things done like that. But it's the coordination between the agencies. And one of the things I've noticed is that there's a good amount of concern in the federal agencies for the flow that comes through. They have shot clocks internally that if they don't get something done a certain way within a certain time, it reflects badly on them, not on the applicant. That's something to consider. That's why relationships are so important in those settings. I could talk for hours. So best ask the next question.
Yeah, we all have a yard-long list of problems where it didn't work well. Yes, there's nightmares. Yeah, so
One of the things that I did hear was the frustration from one of the older time folks who was like basically like back in the day we could build this. I put in I get the money and I'd start building, and 3 days later we'd have something, and now it's years. And I pushed him a little bit on it, and he was basically saying it's frustrating when he has to go through 3 different processes for like the same land crossing for 3 different agencies, and just repetition and just waiting for a response in that. So I hear that, and I feel like this is something that will continue to be an issue that we deal with on my shows and the program within ILSR, because I feel like a fundamental issue of our time is dealing with processes that we have put up with for too long that don't work. We need processes that protect the environment and encourage investment and that work. And so execution is going to be something that we focus on over and over again.
I would venture to say years ago, he built in those places without asking anybody. That's how he did it fast. I believe the rules were still there then too.
It's possible. Yeah. And
Was
you
he
would
one
know,
of those
Doug.
that asked for forgiveness, in other words?
Yes, I believe he's one of those
Well,
guys
I mean,
in the old days, at least. Yeah,
well, and up there's definitely a sense that there's a different set of rules, right?
right.
And so people have different takes on how to interpret them. And I'm always recollecting a story that I heard of someone who could not get a permit in West Texas, and the sheriff really wanted to see the project get done. He said, "Come out here, meet me at 2 a.m." He said, "You got 4 hours, get it done, and get out." Okay, BEAD. We're gonna talk about BEAD, and so I haven't been paying close attention, but I don't get the sense that there's a whole lot of people that have been connected with BEAD dollars. And I was told by credible sources within the federal government that they were going to make it go faster. So I want to start with you, Drew. What's the latest on BEAD? What's happened recently that we should be focused on?
Yeah, I guess maybe the 2 big items of news is that the vast majority of states and territories right now have actually signed their award agreement. So we are finally, I'm sick of myself even saying this. but we are finally getting closer to the part where we can start construction. Indeed, some have already signed some states have already signed contracts with ISPs, that's the final line. I think one of the things that have been very confusing and made this process seem interminable is that there are so many seeming final lines. We have NTIA's approval, we have NIST approval, we have them signing the award agreement, then accepting the terms and conditions, and then signing the agreement with the ISP. But we are getting to that final step.
Yeah,
I will say though, we are
we did a
behind where we
we
might
did
have
a
been. Sorry,
Drew,
go ahead,
just
Chris.
we did we hiked to the top of Guadalupe Peak, which is 4.1 miles, 25% grade, I think roughly 20%, 25 on average, and at 8,700 feet. And my 10-year-old is with us, and I felt like you're on every corner. You're like, are we there yet? Or where's the peak? Like it's so
Yes.
close. And you get up there and you're like, we gotta go down. There's no like tram, like gotta walk all the way back. And I feel like that's sort of where we were. We're like, oh, we're at we're at the end. It's like,
The bead
no,
switchbacks.
there's
Been a
so
lot of
much,
them.
more. Yeah.
I want to make sure though, like we're behind where we would have been had they not touched
Right.
things.
If they had just,
If
if they
they
just
just
moved
taken their
forward,
hands off the wheel when they came
yeah.
into office and done nothing, I think they would have gotten better results faster. And we might already see people connected. We also wouldn't have the way they did it under the former administration was staggered, where they would be approving people and people would be starting construction at different times. It still is to a certain extent, but it's much more clustered. So there's going to be ISPs sort of fighting for the same workforce and permits because a lot of this work is going to be started at once. And the delays, I think, advantage Starlink. Like this has been another sort of benefit to the Starlink program is just the fact that the BEAD process is slowed down. The one other, and we could talk about this later, but the non-deployment news. So,
Yeah. We'll come back to that in a couple minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
All right, Heather, you and I had talked about this. You are, depending on the day, working with state broadband offices or with entities who are recipients of those funds. And in our discussion about it, you suggested to me that there are a number of challenges that remain to be overcome.
Certainly. Well, operationalizing things is some of the hardest work that I think any state broadband office does. We've spent a lot of time thinking about getting here, and now we're here. And so, just for example, getting things ready to put in your ESA into the ESAP system, whether an ISP or a state, requires a lot of herding of cats. Requires that you have the right team on both the ISP side and the state side to look over the materials. Because what the state is doing in ESAPs to get to that CADX or whatever determination is filtering through all of the project information, working with the subrecipient to make sure that it makes sense, meaning what the NEPA sub-project areas might be. And it becomes something of a very large chessboard. What can we move? When can we move it? How is it going to fit in overall? Explaining to everybody as well how timing overlaps. Like we're starting EHP permitting processes now. We haven't gotten to contract yet in a number of places. And that's very much on purpose because by the time we get to contract, we want to have a really good idea of what their NEPA sub-project areas look like and how it all is going to come together so that after they've signed the contract, that permitting process should be fairly quick, depending on what we're doing. But that's just the EHP piece of it. That's the environmental. The local permitting matters. The Department of Transportation stuff matters. Satisfying all of the requirements prior to putting a shovel in the ground. All of that is a lot for anybody to handle. Now we're going to do it 150 times per state, sometimes more, depending on how many sub-projects they have together. And I would say the timeline-wise, the way that some of the approvals have happened has sort of created a natural sort of role, if you will. But there's only 3 states that don't have approval for their final proposal yet. I think the thing that we're going to run up against right now, as far as timelines are concerned, is when we actually have to have those contracts signed. because in every contracting situation I've been in, when it's multiple organizations, unless a state of emergency has been declared and we can get by a whole bunch of things, it takes time to get through even a standard contract where there are no changes, because the discussions have to happen about why they're not changing this sort of thing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it all sort of comes together as well.
Doug, what's happening on BEAD?
I think we're gonna see a lot of defaults, that people are not gonna end up signing the contracts. So they're getting the whole way to that endpoint. First off, I know of folks who it turns out they didn't really have the financing lined up, and you have to have the financing locked to get your
Mhm.
contract signed. You can't have like, "Oh, yeah, we're gonna borrow the money." That's not good enough. You have to have your it's like, well, it turns out they didn't have that done, so it turns out they can't get their letter of credit or whatever. So we're gonna see folks fall off the map for that. Um, there are people who are just believe it or this process where they and the benefit of bargain, they sometimes gave the broadband offices said, "You have to take this lower price," and they gave you, like, 5 to 10 days to make up your mind. So most of them said yes, and now they're doing their math, and they're going, "I can't afford to build this project anymore." So I know several folks who are gonna just bail because it no longer makes any sense. They cut the grant down too far. And it was
Right, there might have
ridiculous
been
that
a
after
marching
all these
hold.
years of crawling along, they made you make big financial decisions in, like, 5 working days. I've never seen anything like
And
this to some of
that
these
was
things.
before the price of oil jumped up significantly, and
Yes.
that
Oh, yeah, it was
changes everything. If we
but it but
remember.
but even without that, I mean, when you went from 9,000 a passing to 6,000 a passing as example, that's a really big difference of grants.
Right,
So,
it is, and
yeah,
you lost all of the margin, right? Where if
yes,
you're getting the 9,000, and that's not because your costs were necessarily all
no,
that, but because you had a contingency, I'm guessing,
right, right.
and that got destroyed.
So Heather referred to it, the contracting process has taken a whole lot longer than folks thought, 'cause, you said it earlier, Heather, you need to do all your homework. An amazing number of BEAD applicants didn't do any of their homework. They didn't look at environmental, they didn't really get their financing lined up, they didn't really have a solid business plan. So now before they sign the contract, they're doing all that, and they never really looked at the contract hard before. And those contracts are complex, and so I just think we're gonna see a lot of defaults, or my understanding, Heather, is you have 6 months to get the contract signed, right? The state does.
So it's a great question, because
Yeah.
6 months from when?
Yeah,
When the letter was received, or when it was
I don't know.
drafted, or when it was signed?
I think
Because
Heather's saying
that's
no one knows for
6 months
sure.
Right, well,
in.
no one knows for sure, but there's 6 months of something before all the state contracts have to be signed. A lot of people are just not gonna be ready to sign them. They'll th I don't think they're I believe they'll probably let that date slip, but maybe not, who knows? Uh,
One of the most
well,
important
to
lessons
finish up,
I
the
have.
last question is, what happens to all the defaults? What happens to it?
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Um, I
Gotta
think,
run another round.
we'll see. I think it'll
Non-deployment.
differ based on the states. We'll see. I think the federal government is prepared to just declare victory no matter what. I mean, enough people have already been left behind. A few more. Doug, you made the point that a lot of people didn't do their homework. I do feel like for younger people who are watching this show, I had in grad school my advisor, actually, she was brilliant, and she required an unattainable amount of reading before each class. And we had to learn how to get by when one could not humanly achieve that. And one of the things that I think that set me up for was understanding that in life, a lot of people haven't done the homework. And first of all, if you do the homework, Heather's a person that does the homework, from what I can tell, always. And, you have an advantage, and also you got to learn how to get by, even if you don't do it. And there's a lot of people who get used to that, and sometimes you get caught. You get caught with your pants down, is the phrase, and you get in trouble. So there's some of that happening too. Now, I want to move on before we break up with the non-deployment funds.
Oh,
We were going to know by now what was happening with them, but as Doug Adams has reminded us, the Trump administration continues to call them savings, as in they're saving the federal taxpayer dollars. And they're not savings if they then get used for permitting, as Drew mentioned earlier today, which would be a pretty good use of them as far as things go, or for digital equity to make sure that our veterans and other like older adults and everyone else can actually use the networks that are being built. But do we have any predictions as to when we will find out and what will happen on that day?
Well, what we know most recently is that last week, Secretary Lutnick was before the committee, for Congress last week, and he said under pressure that guidance may come out in 2 months, which would be late June. They have missed deadlines in the past, so who knows? This is also tied up in the whole the BEAD non-deployment money is kind of being held hostage as part of the AI executive order, the administration's goal to like prevent states from regulating AI. If you do that, you may jeopardize your BEAD money. And to just highlight how big of issue this is, the median amount states are going to can expect from non-deployment is almost $350 million. That's the median amount for states. This whole pot, $22 billion, most of the BEAD program. But Chris, to your point, at present, we don't really know how states can use their money, when they're going to get access to it, or even if they'll be able to use it due to some AI regulation that they have. So a lot of questions remain. I've noted like every single statement NTI puts out about non-deployment, they seem to mention permitting as a potential use, public safety like E911. They're starting to mention filling in infrastructure holes, so maybe those be defaults. But how do you do that if you consider satellite good enough service? And then recently they started talking about workforce too. I have to mention too, they keep continually ignoring that the law says broadband adoption and broadband affordability are also eligible uses. So that's the best that I know to date. Except there's the victory too. They keep referring to it as savings, but it does seem they're going to make it available to the states. And for the longest time, that was not a sure thing. We did not know that states were going to get this money. They really seem to be working as hard as possible to take this money from the states, put it back into Treasury, use it to pay for their war or whatever.
Right, let's be very clear. That would be an illegal action. This is
It
money
would
that
be an
Congress has
illegal action.
appropriated. And so we are talking about whether or not we are surprised that the Trump administration may follow the law in allowing states to use money that Congress deliberately gave them.
Right. And they wrote into that law, if you don't use all the money, here's what you're supposed to do with it. You redistribute it to other states. So Congress explicitly contemplated this potentiality and addressed it. And yet there's still major doubt as if the administration will sort of abide by that law.
Yeah. Doug?
My guess is in 2 months, we're gonna get another delay. So they're either gonna delay it forever to just kinda hope it dies off because it'll be too late. But if they finally do come out, my expectation would be a very narrow list of things you can use it for, meaning most states won't be able to use most of their money, and that's why it's still savings. You keep talking about permitting. As soon as you sign your contract, you do your NEPA and you do your permitting. They're all gonna be done by the time they figure out they need this money for this. It's you know, permitting will all those signed contracts this year will get their permitting done this year. That's what you do before you get the plows going. So it's too late for that in most cases. So because that using it for permitting is very complicated. You got to go to the county and go, let me help you hire 2 more people and all that. That's not a real like instant snap thing to do. So I think the list will be so narrow that it's not going to make much benefit. Remember, the big use in there that we thought it was going to go for was to do MDUs in urban areas that don't have any good broadband. That was going to use all the money in a lot of states because there's a huge need there. That's gone. That's not on anybody's list. So, yeah.
Heather, closing comments?
Yeah, in the Senate hearing, he said it'll be about 2 months. And then the next day in the House hearing, he did not say 2 months. He said that we're going to do new and exciting things with it. So, Doug, I co-sign with you in saying, I think, yes, the money will come. I think the money will come in as hard a chance to get it as possible. It will be very, very, very challenging for any state to get that money. The problem that I have with the way that the administration talks about BEAD funding and the savings and the benefit of the bargain is that they've removed the words quality and value from that. And that means to me down the road, what we're going to have to do is run another program to get past this hump where we're at. Like we said earlier, LEO satellite, it works. It's certainly a thing that can be used, but I'm going to say the word affordability here. It's not affordable. Even with the programs that they offer now, it's not affordable. In the remote project, the remote thing that I have, I had to pay $200+ for the device that I had. And I know with BEAD, they're going to give you the device in that regard, but it's still not something that a lot of people have an appetite for. And I worry about that. How are they going to change the perception of LEO so that it is an acceptable alternative to fiber based? If it really is that good, it should pick up. But I think quality and value are the things that we should be talking about when it comes to what kind of services our tax dollars are installing for people to use. And we keep hearing that some people will just have to do with not fiber. And I think that that's a bit of a disservice to those people. And I also think it means that we've inadvertently, or maybe they did it advertently, but probably inadvertently created a class system of who gets what.
Yep.
Overall. The other thing I'll say too is that sort of runs through everything when we were talking about permitting earlier today. People need to realize, people in the administration need to realize, there are some localities that run their entire organization publicly through Facebook. They have a Facebook page. That's where they do all of their communications and everything. And that's fine for them because it works. You try to run 100 permits in a week through that organization, it will stop in its tracks. So those are the kinds of things that people need to understand when we're talking about updates to permitting processes like that. Not everybody's bootstraps are the same, and pulling them up is fine. But if they break on the way, it means we've got to replace the bootstrap.
That's a good place to cut it off. There's much more to say. I wish we had the time to go into affordability programs. It was discussed on the recent Building for Digital Equity episode that ran without me 2 weeks ago. You can find that on the National Digital Inclusion Alliance YouTube page, or I think on ours too, at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And then there was a question in the chat, which was whether or not mobile networks were getting worse, why that was the case. And Doug, just very briefly, there was a response from Cassie that I really appreciated. But one thing I would say is that I think a part of it is also just running hotter. Like, they used to have more slack capacity. Now there is much less. They're doing more with what they have, and so it's not able to get out to the fringes as much. But also,
They're
they
using
just
a
don't have
lot of the
capacity.
capacity for FWA. That doesn't leave much for cell phones. Yeah, that's a part of it for sure. So yes.
All right. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We're going to try and do these around once a month, and then more often if there's some sort of major thing where we need to have some immediate, uneditable commentary from folks that can jump into an Unbuffered. We are very thankful for our guests, Doug, Drew, and Heather today, as well as Travis and Kim for getting us to this point after all those years of Connect This. So thank you once again for joining us. We'll see you in the next Unbuffered Live.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Unbuffered podcast. We have transcripts for this and other episodes available at ilsr.org/podcast. While you're there, check out our other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. Email us at podcast@communitynets.org with your ideas for the show. Follow us on Blue Sky. Our handle is @CommunityNets. You can catch the latest research from all of our initiatives by subscribing to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount helps keep us going. Unbuffered is produced by Christopher Mitchell with editing provided by me, Jordan Pittman. Special thanks to Riverside for providing the song Caveman. Until next time, thanks for listening.